right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Andrew Townsend. I'm an e-learning evangelist here with eLearning Brothers. Today we're going to be talking about using storytelling in e-learning. It should be a really exciting webinar talking about how to improve our e-learning courses. This webinar is being recorded. This will be posted on our website eventually within the next week, and we'll also email a copy of it out to everyone that's in attendance. If you have questions during the webinar, please do use the questions panel. We're also going to be asking some questions of you, and we'd hope that you can participate in that questions panel. Just so you know, one of the things we like to do after the webinar is try to follow up as soon as possible. Sometimes it's just to get feedback. Most of the time, we'd like to touch base and find out if anyone needs some one-on-one clarification about our webinar topics after the fact. You can always email us as well. Adam loves to answer any questions that you may have about any of his content, any of his webinars. So, like I said, if you have questions, you can email us, and we'll give you that information at the end. All right, so without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you, Adam. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks. It's great to be here. Great to have everyone here. It looks like we've got quite a good size crowd. I'm going to try to stay in the camera and also close to the microphone so you can see me. I appreciate you being here. There was a reason that this topic came up, and it's been in discussions with a lot of the people that I've talked to over the years about how to design good e-learning, and I've done other topics on kind of good instructional design and preparing for your e-learning creation. And so I wanted to touch on this one about putting storytelling in. Too many times I think we forget about this part of it. So we'll jump right into it. Again, this is part of a slideshow I've created. I apologize if I'm a little hesitant in my speech today. It's I'm coming over something. So let's start off just by sort of going through what is a story. Okay, so a story consists of a structure. You know, whether that's a beginning, middle, end, or some kind of structure it needs to have. It needs to have some character. You know, very seldom do we see a good story without some kind of character, whether that's a human or an animal, or even, you know, in some cases, aliens, robots, or, you know, some sort of anthropomorphized object. It's going to have a plot. I mean, that's kind of what a story is the plot. It tells a story, and then there's a conflict and resolution. And there may be more things that we could add to this slide, but those are kind of the four basic things that you need to think about when you think about a story. And so we're going to look at this. You know, we've all sat through e-learning that has no story to it whatsoever. And so we're going to look at one right now that I'm going to pull over here for just a second, and we'll look at it. And so we'll just go through this really quickly. So you see that there's not really a story here. There's a lot of e-learnings that start with this kind of thing, sort of an objective list, or a list of topics, whether that's a table of contents kind of thing, or a list of chapters or sections. That's not really, I mean, yes, a book starts with the table of contents, but if you think about the good stories you've been to in you know, or participated in or consumed in your lifetime, you probably haven't run into ones that start off by, you know, listing the things that you're going to cover in the story. You know, what fun would that be to read Harry Potter or The Lord of the Rings or the Chronicles of Narnia and have it listing all the things that you're going to discuss in that story. And then there's, you know, e-learning that has pages after pages of text without really any kind of, you know, any kind of coherence, any kind of structure to it. You know, this is just sort of regurgitating facts. This is, you know, and then there's a picture in here for a picture's sake that's not really good, and you know, where's the story behind this, and so forth. And so you can see that there's some some really bad examples of story, and you know, I went through and created one really quickly. Again, you know, kind of we got animations, we've got a list of objectives that we're going to go through. You know, slide after slide. This is actually 4 slides worth of text, and then, you know, just some pictures that pop on there. A summary slide usually that relists the objectives in some format, and then a quiz. And a lot of times the quizzes is by, you know, the quiz is passable without even taking the course. There's no reason to have the quiz in there, and so we look at this and we go, well, I could probably pass this quiz without having the course there. And so we want to think about, you know, what goes into what makes a good story. And so let's look at that. So let's look at, for a minute, what e-learning courses and stories have in common. And so we start off with that, you know, most courses have some kind of objective. We have a goal that we want the learner to accomplish. In story, there's a goal that we want the learner to accomplish. Whether that's in a movie, you know, it's the conflict and resolution, the internal conflict versus external conflict. There's a great blog on our site that maybe we can link to in the thing that talks about the 3-story model of creating a video that Andrew wrote, that talks about, sort of likens it under Star Wars, and talks about the internal and external conflict within the original, what I call the original Star Wars. Star Wars, I guess, called A New Hope is the official title of it now, but it talks about that, and you know, we can link to that and send that to you as well, and you can look at that. But all e-learning courses and all stories have some kind of objective in common. There's usually some decision making that has to happen. At least for good e-learning, there's going to be, you know, some decisions to be made, whether that's in a branching scenario, whether that's in a knowledge check, or a quiz, an evaluation, things like that. There's going to be some decisions to be made. There's usually some kind of imagery in books. A lot of times this is done through very flowing language, through kind of good graphic description. In movies, obviously, this is done through cinematography and so forth. But there's always some imagery, and in e-learning, that's done. We use graphics and icons and whatever to do that. And then there's also a concept or a goal that we're sort of the overarching. That's kind of the story or the plot line that we're going through. And so as we're doing this, we need to look at each of these things and say, how do we find these and put them into our course? And then, of course, there's also a wrap-up or a summary. Sometimes in a movie or in a book, that's just kind of finishing off the story, bringing you to the end, you know, telling you who committed the murder, or telling you what happened to the characters. A lot of times, like we've talked about in e-learning, we see that as a summary slide, but really it's about helping them understand that this is what they've done. This can be done in good e-learning with a story by helping them apply it. Sometimes we can put a game in there to sort of help them apply. So it's that application model. So let's jump into this question really fast. Why do we want to put story in our courses? Why would we even want to talk about this? I've talked about it briefly here, but let's see what your thoughts are. Go ahead and answer. Type your answer in the questions panel, and I'll give you a minute or two to do that.
So Adam, some of these early responses are coming in. Some people are saying to keep it engaging, to maintain interest, to ensure the learner feels engaged, improve retention of knowledge, that's another one, make the course resonate with the learner, to make it more real to the learner, to help participants connect with the topic, to give it structure. That's a one that I hadn't thought of. For continuity, to help everything stay together. Another person says stories are how the brain works. I love that. As a video evangelist, I love that.
Yeah.
To help introduce questions, essential questions, in a meaningful way. Show how the information connects to the use case. Provide context, make it an experience of learning.
Good. Yeah. So those are all great examples, and we're gonna look at that here and say, you know, so they're memorable. Stories are easy to remember. There's a reason that, you know, that Aesop's fables were so, you know, are so commonly used, or the Mother Goose, or the Grimm's fairy tales, or whatever. They're memorable. They're easy for kids to remember. We can all remember the story of the ant and the grasshopper, or, you know, whatever stories from our youth that we've learned that have either taught us a lesson or helped us relate to life experience. They're relatable. Like I just said, we can take them and apply them to our lives. Whether or not we relate with that little brownish alien from another planet who's lost and just wants to phone home, you know, we may not be a brownish alien, but we may want to feel lost or unsure and just need friends, and so we can relate to them. They're engaging. A story is much more engaging than somebody just rattling off page after page of text or droning on, you know, audio. We think about, you know, even documentaries that we watch. They may be telling, you know, a very real life event, but they're done in a way that's engaging, and that we feel like we're part of it, no matter how sort of dull or dry that life event may have been in real life. It becomes engaging through the use of good story, and we see this all the time as directors and cinematographers and whatnot take, you know, what we call creative license and sort of beef up the story somewhat to make it fun. But stories are engaging. They're retrievable. We can remember them. We can recall them. We can go back and say, hey, you know, I remembered this concept, or that this helped me. This story, you know, brings to mind this. I was talking to my daughter today, and as she was getting up and kind of getting ready for the day, and she was telling me about something she learned in one of her classes that, you know, it reminded her of a story that we used to read, you know, when she was a kid. And I said, well, okay, good. So then now you understand why that story was written the way it was. And so we put stories in our courses to make them memorable, to do all of these things. But, you know, I think too many times we see e-learning that isn't memorable, it isn't engaging, because we have left out the story. We've forgotten to go in and do what we need to do to make it work. And so now the question comes, how do we bring story into our e-learning? And there's several ways we can do that. We can do that through video. You know, we might find YouTube videos or videos that we make that can bring the story in, whether that's, you know, we see this a lot in like customer testimonials that talk about why a customer wants to use our product or what benefit they've gotten from our product. We see this sometimes in a customer service scenario where you use a video to show a good customer service interaction. We can do it through music. We can bring music. There's a lot of story that carries that can be carried through music, whether that's just instrumental music or whether that's actual vocal music with story. I mean, we look at one of my passions is musical theater, and I have brothers who joke with me that, well, people don't just randomly break out into song in the middle of, the mall or whatever. And I say, yes, but we do tell stories, and that music is just finding another way of telling a story. And I'm not saying you should put, the theme song from Oklahoma into your e-learning, but a well-placed piece of music can really tell a story. It can help set the mood. It can help underscore the importance of something. or even an audio file there's a lot that can be said from inflection and the nonverbals or subverbal communication in our voices that can carry a lot of meaning and a lot of story that perhaps written text wouldn't carry. We can do it through animations, whether we use animated. I know I'm going to say this wrong. GIF or GIF, whichever one you prefer, or a simple little animation that we've done using a Flash or a Go Animate or some other tool. We see this all the time again in cartoons and things like that. The reason that GIFs are so popular on the internet is because they tell a little mini story. Look at Vine. In 6 seconds, it told a quick story, and it may not have even been a full-on, what you might consider a full-on video, because there was a lot of sort of editing and animation and things that went on, but there were some great stories that were told there. And then, of course, through graphics and artwork. Some of the most powerful things we can do is to tell the story through images. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and so we look at that and finding the right picture to go with our story is really important, and finding a picture that helps tell the story. So how do we go about finding the story? One of the first things to do is to be creative. Start to think about, think outside the box a little bit. Don't always think so literally. Sometimes we think about, I've got to write a course on, how to sell this product, and so we get sort of locked into selling that product, and we don't think about how to liken that product to something else. Again, to take sort of Aesop's fables as a common theme, he taught morals using animals and creatures and people and stories that didn't necessarily teach those morals directly until you got to the end and it said the moral of the story is this, and you understand it. And so don't always think so literally when you're thinking about your concept. Use conceptual ideas or symbolism. Think about ways to represent perseverance. Can be represented by a long distance runner. It can be represented by a lot of different symbols or images. Do the conceptual ideas. I think sometimes what happens is we get into e-learning and we think, well, some of the topics that we're asked to create learning on are somewhat dry and dull, and there's not really anything we can do, but we can conceptualize them. I did a course a few years ago that was about sales prospecting, and my team and I sat down and we talked about sort of what were we talking about with prospecting. We sort of tried to break it down, and we talked about, well, they've got an area and they've got a tool, the various software tools they can use, and they've got their skills and their understanding of the products and so forth. And so we talked about all that, and then we tried to find something that related, and of course sort of the natural thing that bubbled to the surface was an old gold prospector. And so we told the story of old Cletus, and he was out prospecting, and he had an area that was a bend of the river and a nice little shady spot where he could pitch his camp, and the bend in the river where the river slowed down, and so the sediment was greater there, and it would sort of drop the particles. And he had his tools, that was his sifter and his his hammers and different things that he used to get the gold, and his understanding of what was gold and what was sand, and and things like that. And we told that story, and then we could go back, and as we talked about sales prospecting, we could then go back and relate it to so as a salesperson, you have an area that you're prospecting, just like Cletus's his bend in the river that was his, and other prospectors didn't necessarily encroach on his area, he didn't necessarily encroach on theirs. They had tools and you have tools, and so forth. And so be creative and look at that. Sometimes looking at something as simple as homophones, words that sound the same but maybe mean different things. Some people don't like puns, but puns can carry a lot of, at least help you generate some ideas for your story. And so, as we look at this, we we move on to the next step, which is find inspiration everywhere. You can find it in print advertising. You're driving down the road, or you're at the doctor's office and you're flipping through a magazine. You know, it's driving down the road and you see a billboard that you go, "Hi, that's kind of cool." You know, even a billboard in just a few seconds can give you a little bit of a story, or at least a starter for a story. You know, TV shows, a lot of sitcoms or regular serial TV shows have kind of an opening sequence. I saw an e-learning course developed that used Arrested Development's sort of opening sequence as kind of an inspiration for a story. You know, this is the story of one man, and then it could go through and do that. You know, you could use look at it to throw back to my childhood, back to the Brady Bunch. You know, a man marries a woman, each of them has 3 kids, they come together and form a family. You could, you know, do that when talking about, you know, whether you're talking about chemical bonding of elements. You know, you might have some fun with it that way. So find inspiration everywhere. Print, radio, TV, you know, even kids' stories, or even, you know, listening to your kids tell stories. And then probably most importantly is don't settle for the status quo. Don't just because everyone's doing it doesn't mean that it's necessarily right. You might be in a company or somewhere where they say, well, you know, we want all of our things to look the same, or we've done it this way, or we're just taking PowerPoint and converting it over. Just because everyone's doing it doesn't mean that it's right or that you should do it. Also, make sure, particularly as e-learning designers, that when it comes to telling story, that you present it to the powers that be, and you explain the reasoning behind it. Sometimes, you know, CEOs and whatnot may say, you know, that doesn't seem very professional. You're just telling stories, and you know, and yet they're telling stories all the time. Their salespeople are telling the story of their products and so forth, and there's a lot to be said there. And don't just settle for, you know, okay, I'm going to fire up whatever tool I'm using, whether that's Captivate or PowerPoint or Storyline or Lectora or any one of the myriad of others, and say, I'm just going to go with the defaults. You know, we've all seen PowerPoints where we could tell that they picked one of the default themes, they just used the bullet points all throughout, and they went in and they just grabbed it and said, and there was no thought to it, no story to it. And so make sure that as you do that, you're not just blindly going with whatever the default is. One other thing that you should think about is you need to think about using a template. And many of you might be our eLearning Brothers customers, but for those who aren't, you should look at our template library. We have hundreds of great templates that can guide you through all sorts of things, and there's, you know, these can give you some kind of inspiration for your story. There are great course starters. If we look at, for instance, Storyline, and we go into course starters, there are whole stories that are kind of pre-built here, where you come in and it shows you, you know, we're going to give you a set of slides and probably some characters and so forth that you can go through and can help you build out that story. But by the same token, don't get locked in to say, oh, you know what, this is a CrossFit template. I don't want to necessarily use this one. You know, or mine isn't about cross-training. Sometimes it's about looking at the guts and the meat and bones of the template and being a little creative and saying, how can I tell the story using this template? And so as we go through that, we need to think about, you know, what are the, you know, how do we go about getting that inspiration and that engagement and putting stories into our courses? And it's really about kind of these 3 things of being creative, of finding that creative spark, whatever it takes for you to be creative, finding that inspiration everywhere. You know, not just looking at, your course outline or the white paper that you've been given that says this is what the course needs to be. Sometimes in talking to our SMEs, we can get inspiration from them as we listen to them talk passionately about their product or their course or their system that they're doing, and we can hear them tell, here's why I created this to do this, and here's what this is supposed to do. And a lot of times that's not captured, is the whys and the hows and the wherefores and whatnot. And so we can capture that and tell our story, and when we're done, we have an engaging, memorable story that to really help propel our e-learning forward. Think about, we've talked about some of the, take a minute and as you, let me try to word this the right way. Let's take just a second and think about some of the stories that you've read over the years that are memorable to you, and let's talk about why, whether that's a movie or a book or a children's book or a TV show or whatever. What are some memorable stories that you had and why? And we'll give you a couple minutes to just reply to those.
So Adam, while those are coming in, one person does want to know, do we have e-learning templates that work in Captivate?
Yes, we do have e-learning templates that work in Captivate, that work in all of the e-learning tools. Let me go back and we'll let me grab them here. So we have scads of templates and icon libraries and whatever. Here's a Captivate theme. This works in Captivate. You come in, you've got various slides here. You've got kind of a city theme to it. Again, you've got some ideas for layouts. You've got some ideas for, ways you could use it. This is really, some of these are really no more than just like a PowerPoint master slide kind of layout, but they still can generate some ideas of, oh, you know what, there's a big city. That's kind of a metropolis, a bustling thing. I could use that for some course somewhere, and so there's lots of information there. So let's see if there's any other responses that
Sure, there's lots of stories, influential stories in people's lives. The Dark Tower, Into the Woods. One person mentions The Never-Ending Story. Charlotte's Web. There's an emotional connection with Charlotte, who is willing to die for her friend Wilbur. Personal stories. That's a great one. Lord of the Rings, that's a good example of good versus evil. Favorite story as a kid, Old Yeller. Another one is Ghost World. The Vikings television series tells a good story. That's one that was brought up. The Breakfast Club tells a great story. The Sinking of the Titanic. Now that's a story to use for e-learning.
Yeah.
Any stories, Michelle writes, any story that taps into emotion and makes you feel something. Whatever you're experiencing at the time in your life, you'll find something that will touch your emotions. So that's a great thought.
Yeah, and so as we look at these things, is there a reason we can't do these, put these kind of reasons into our e-learning? I mean, maybe we don't want to do e-learning that makes people cry, but we want to connect with people, and the ways we connect is through these stories. And so I really encourage you to go out and look at your e-learning development and look at your course requests and whatever, and sit down and talk with your subject matter experts and your management teams and your training teams and say, let's look at how we can spice these up. We don't have to start every e-learning with an objective slide. Think about the objectives in for instance, to take Lord of the Rings. We look at that and we say, okay, we understand within the first dozen pages or so what one of the main objectives is. He's got to get that ring and destroy it, right? I mean, it's no one has sat down and said, okay, in this book, by the end of this book, Frodo will have destroyed the ring. We don't make that list of objectives, but yet we do it in our e-learning. And learning needs to be relatable and needs to be really understandable, and whether we, however we choose to do that, I think it's great.
If I might add something there, while we're reading Lord of the Rings, we may not consciously say, okay, there's this ring and it needs to be destroyed. That's going to happen by the end of the book. But subconsciously, we do make steps when reading stories or watching stories, saying, okay, these are the hurdles that our antagonist and protagonist are going to have to face and fight each other over. We do know those basic points. So knowing that, it is, like you said, very, very applicable over to e-learning. There's questions that come up, and you're probably going to answer this later, but I wanted to voice these now. There's questions that say, when picking the story, when picking the story that you're going to use in your e-learning, what are some of the limits or restraints that you should put on it? For example, Lord of the Rings, if you think Frodo's going to destroy that ring by the end of the book, you're going to be disappointed. You've got to read 2 more books before you get there, and it's a huge story, so that might not be a great example if you're going to use it in detail for a short 5-minute e-learning course. So what are some of the limits that you put on here?
Well, okay, so you're right. One of the big limits is the length of the course. You know, what are we trying to accomplish, and how can we accomplish that? You know, we see all the time on social media the abbreviation TLDR. You know, too long, didn't read, and here's a quick summary of it. But think about, what are you trying to teach? One of the things that I found that stories really help me with is it helps me to sort of modularize my e-learning. If I say, I'm trying to teach 15 things in one story, that may not work. You know, maybe I say, I'm going to try to teach one in one story and then come back and do another one, and instead of having a course, I've got a curriculum now that is made up of a bunch of little stories. But limitations would be, you know, obviously make sure you keep it appropriate. Think about the audience that you're talking to. If you are doing an international audience, you know, you may not want to talk specifically about something that is only relatable in your country or in your culture. You obviously need to be very culturally and racially all kinds of sensitive, you know, whether it's race, gender, age, you know, body type, things like that. Be very sensitive in it, which is why a lot of times authors will use animals or creatures. You know, there was a news article several years ago when the first Smurfs animated movie came out that it wasn't allowed in Norway because it didn't show any black Smurfs. And the creator of the Smurfs said, well, that was the whole reason they were blue, is that there wasn't, you know, I wasn't trying to say they were white or they were, you know, Mexican or they were whatever, but they were blue. They were all, and yet, you know, so we have to be very cognizant of you know, those sensitivities that our people may have. We have to be cognizant of what you know, of brand consciousness. We want to make sure we're telling a story that stays true to our branding and our company. You know, here at eLearning Brothers, we've got kind of this rock star mentality, so we might go a little crazier with some of our stories and sort of put that rock star theme into it, whereas a company like perhaps American Express, where it's a little bit more, you know, branded and more, I don't want to say more professional, but, you know, in some ways it's more straight-laced. They might say, you know what, we don't want to have, you know, these bells and whistles and these things going off, so we want a story that tells the story of our products. And so continuing
in that thought, also, yeah. Mark mentions it's wise to be careful not to violate copyright. You might not want to use Lord of the Rings and pull that into your lesson too closely. Another thought on what you had said, where you could maybe make a full curriculum around one story, but make smaller modules around stories. Kathy says, are you recommending bringing a theme or a story into the whole course, or what do you think about bringing a small story into one module? What are your thoughts on that, Adam?
Well, when I sit down to design a course or a kind of a learning path, I'm going to think about, you know, am I designing this course kind of in a bubble where it's going to be the only module that sits out there and it's a very small little thing? Nowadays, most modules we're trying to design e-learning to be reusable, recyclable, repurposable, and so we're going to use this module in multiple places. And so that's where I may say, you know what, I want this mini story to be here, and then if I decide I want to make it part of a bigger story, I can try to build that story around it. But sometimes I'll start with that bigger story and say, okay, this is what I want, sort of like, again, not trying to violate copyright violations, but like the Lord of the Rings example of where it spans 3 books or I can't remember, like 7 movies or whatever. It's where it spans a number of books. You can say, okay, in this module, I want to cover this section of that overall story. And it's really good if you've got like a career path you want them to go down, and so you're telling that story of of a salesperson or a new hire. A great example of storytelling is in new hire curriculum, where instead of just saying, hi, here's the company, and dull and dry, you actually walk them through a new hire story, and part of that is, how do I get to my desk? How do I find the restrooms? How do I, where's the lunchroom? How do I log onto the computer and check my email and check phone messages and use this system and that system? And all throughout there's these little mini stories that pop up that you can tell. But the answer is it kind of depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And so as you sit down and go to design your e-learning, all I'm saying is I encourage you to think about incorporating story. I don't think there's necessarily a right or a wrong way to do that. It's going to depend on your company and your needs and whatnot, but really find a way to think about, can I make this engaging and relatable and memorable and retrievable through the use of story, whether that's a mini story or a bigger story in the module.
Okay, one last question before I let you carry on here. Someone asks about humor. You told the story of the Smurfs, about how it may not have been culturally accepted across the plane, and humor is very similar that way. It can get dicey. So how much do you avoid humor, or do you use it extremely sparingly? What's your attitude there?
If I'm going to use humor, I'm going to understand my audience that when I create it. I'm going to make sure, because humor isn't, a joke isn't the same across cultural boundaries and countries and whatever, even if you speak the same language. I mean, we were just talking about this on our team yesterday, that sometimes there's terms that we use in American English that aren't necessarily the same in British English, and
right.
could be looked at as offensive. And so what I may see as an innocent attempt at humor, it could be construed as very offensive. So be very careful with humor. Humor, if you're going to use it at all, use it sparingly, but use it purposefully. Understand your audience, and then be very, kind of low, almost child. I don't want to say childish, but childlike in your humor, in terms of, you don't want to get into the simplicity. Yeah, you want to keep it to where it can't really offend anybody. Just a simple joke here or there, a simple chuckle, whether that's a funny picture, things like that. But really think it through. We live in an era where there's so many things that can trigger people and can cause people offense and that we get offended by, and so we need to really be cautious in any of our things that we do, in anything that we do in e-learning, whether that's choosing the characters that we put into our e-learning course. We need to obviously be sensitive there to, are we using enough male, female, culturally diverse characters? Do we have disabled people? Do we have kids? Do we have older people? Things like that. And so that same goes for humor and for story and course.
Okay, we'll take more questions later on, but I'll go ahead and let you continue.
So, I mean, that's kind of where I'm at in this thing, was just at the, just wrapping up. I just want to, these are great questions, and there's a lot to ponder when you put in story, which may be why a lot of people don't use story, is because sometimes it's difficult. It requires some work to think about and some creativity. And as e-learning designers, we're very creative. we can think about, okay, I need to add these triggers to a course or to an object to make it do this, and we're very creative with that kind of thing. But sometimes we get so overwhelmed by things. We look at we put in animations that spin just to have animations and make it look cool, and we think this will be engaging because I've got all these things spinning and flashing and flying on the screen, but we don't really think about the purpose behind it. And so, like I said, there's other blogs and webinars I've done that talk about more of that purposeful design and things like that. But as you're looking at story, understand that it does take a little bit of work to sit down and do it. It does take some creativity, but it really pays off in the long run. People will remember. The training will become what we call sticky. It'll stick in their minds if they have a story to go with it.
So here's a few more of the few more questions. One is, you showed an example of a bad use of storytelling at the very beginning. Do you have an example of a good use of storytelling? Do you have a course that we can link them to, or a story about one of your great storytelling courses, something like that?
I will make sure that gets sent out in a link. It was a little hard to sort of present in this environment, but I will make sure it gets sent out in a link, and then it also in the blog recap.
Okay.
In the webinar recap, we'll put a link to good examples of that. I was trying to find this morning that prospector course in my archive, and I know it's somewhere, and I just wasn't able to track it down.
Sure. Another question is, how do you distinguish between gamification and storytelling? Because a lot of people will use gamification for a lot of the same reasons you said to use storytelling. Do those go hand in hand? Are they different? How do you distinguish?
They are different. We look at a game, for instance, like Candy Crush. They do their best to try to throw in some story into that game, but in reality, all you're doing is you're playing a game. You're clicking on candies and switching them places. Angry Birds, same thing. There's not really a progression through the story. If we come back, I do want to show you one. I'm going to show you one example here of a good game that uses story in an excellent way. And this is a brand new game that just got put into our library. It's this Evelyn's Quest.
And what we can do for this, because the demo that you're showing is working, but we will include in the email that goes out to everybody that has a copy of this webinar, we'll also include links to some more information about this awesome storyline game. So this was built by one of our designer developers, Bill Milstead. He did a session on it at DevLearn, actually, a stage presentation about how he used only no JavaScript or anything, just storyline triggers and what storyline offers, and made this amazing interactive game. But he also told a story.
Right, and see, this is an example of a game that tells a story, because you've got this Evelyn who's going through and she's trying to accomplish, and it's kind of uses the hero's journey storyline. But then you look at a jump game or a match 3 game, and there's, like I say, sometimes they sort of force a story in there, but really all you're doing is you're just switching things up. And so there is a difference between gamification and storytelling, and they're not. Sometimes they cross over a little bit in a Venn diagram, but they're not always the same thing. And games can be used to enhance your story. I talk about decision making. If you're going through and you're telling a story, and maybe it's a customer service scenario, you can use a little bit of gamification to make that decision making. Hey, Sally's got to make a decision about what response to give this customer, and then as they respond, they might get a badge, or they might get a green check mark, or their strength meter goes up, or whatever. And so it's a little bit of gamification and a little bit of story. But to just say I'm going to throw a game in and there I've got a story, there are a lot of games that aren't really stories.
Another comment here. This person says, we are combining soft skills, which is conceptual, with tech skills, how to use the software, things like that. Sometimes it seems a little like a conflict of interest. Any advice? I think this may be a tie-in back to that internal and external conflict.
Right, and so you've got your I mean, if we look at soft skills, for instance, the communicating effectively, and then the technical skills of perhaps using email and social media and even phone etiquette, to tie together, or the company systems to come together. There is ways, and that's really a good place where you could pull in some story, because you've got the soft skills that can be told kind of from a first person or third person narrative of, I'm going through and I need to solve this problem, and in order to do that, I need to switch over here into the system. And you can, again, make a software simulation that doesn't necessarily carry the whole story, but it's part of that story. So that as you're looking at it, you've got John trying to solve this problem, and so he goes into Salesforce and enters his stuff, and then that helps him to progress down the rest of it, which now gives him some information that he can use when he's talking to his client about, similar businesses or competitors or whatever. And so, to tie in those soft skills into that, or your performance management system into, your coaching soft skills, things like that. I think there's a lot of ways you can do that, and so I hope that kind of addressed that question.
Aaron asks, how do you recommend using storytelling in very technical training?
So again, storytelling can be about the how and the why. Even a simple story of, I've got this financial, maybe for a mortgage company, I've got this financial system that I need to use, and we've been mandated to use it. But to understand the whys, why do I want to do this? What does clicking on this field do? Understanding that is a story in itself. A story doesn't necessarily always have to start out, once upon a time there was a boy named, Julio. It can be just the story of the why, of why is this system, this piece of technical software, hardware designed the way it is, and how can I explain to users, because if they understand the whys and the hows, then it makes it more relevant to them. They can say, oh, I understand now that when it's asking here, I'm not just regurgitating information, but this is what it's trying to get at. This is the ultimate goal. And so if we look at that technical, training always has that ultimate goal in mind that we talked about, that final objective that we're trying to get to. And so finding those steps and those little mini stories along the way is a great way to do it.
We'll just take one more question here. Where does the learning come in? When you're telling a story, how do you make the story reach the learner? How do you make it teach something?
Well, again, to go back to Aesop, or to Grimm's fairy tales, or Hans Christian Andersen, all of those were some great storytellers that incorporated learning in there. Even Dr. Seuss, put learning into his stories. Sometimes in a subtle way. Sometimes you never quite came out of it going, oh, this was the big concept, but later you sort of go, oh, that's the symbolism there. I get that. The Sneetches with the star-bellied Sneetches was an example of kind of racism. And it taught the story. Sometimes in an e-learning course, you want to bring them back around and say, here's why we told this story, or here's sort of what we hope you got out of this. But that learning happens through knowledge checks, through decision-making along the way. And so as you're telling the story, think about the Choose Your Own Adventure series. You go through, they choose a story, it branches them. There's learning that's involved there. There's learning that's involved in, understanding, making the right decision in a multiple-choice quiz. We learn through stories all the time. Our kids learn through stories. We've learned through stories. And while it may not be specifically said, this is the learning section, we learn and we grow and we become better because of it. A story like Lord of the Rings, we may not necessarily walk away from that saying, gee, I've learned something. But if we're reading, Diary of Anne Frank, or, a documentary or a biography or whatever, there may be some learning that happens there. But I think every story teaches us something in some way, and so it's a matter of crafting the story in such a way that that learning is part of the story without having to be sort of slap you in the face. This is what you learn. This is what you're going to learn. This is what you learned, and now this is what and now you're going to learn it. So
awesome. Thank you, Adam. Thank you so much for these thoughts, and we'll continue the conversation through an email. I'll go ahead and send an email to you guys in the next few hours. We'll include as many links as we can. Adam's going to keep trying to find his prospector example. He mentioned at the beginning that we published a blog about the 3-act structure that kind of outlines more of this in depth, dives into an example. It gives a good example of using the 3-act structure in the movies and then using the 3-act structure in e-learning. So we'll get you a link to that as well. We'll get you a copy of this webinar for you to be able to reference later, and we'll get you as many things as we can. We try to make those emails that go out afterwards to be very useful and filled with goodies. Speaking of goodies, we showed you some of the templates that are available in our library. You can schedule a free demo to get walked through any of those, or you can just go to elearningbrothers.com and check out those templates there, and we'll get these all sent out. We're excited to see what kind of courses you guys create. We always love to get users sending in courses with that used our templates, and we showcase those from time to time. So if you've got a great course that uses eLearning Brothers templates, please contact us and send it in. Again, thank you so much, Adam. We love this. We had a lot of attendees here, a lot of people that were finding what you had very useful. So I hope you guys enjoy telling stories and have more success telling stories, and join us next time.
Thanks.